Kathy Stanek Cousins was a 27-year-old woman trapped in a loveless marriage.
She felt tied down. She just didn't want to be married anymore.
Until she took comfort in the arms of her handsome next-door neighbor, Tim Koile.
She thought Tim could be the knight in shining armor.
Their mutual attraction quickly sparked an obsessive affair.
The relationship was very hot and sensual.
They were madly in love.
But the lovers' neighborhood fling would ultimately lead to tragedy.
The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head.
Now, go behind the scenes with detectives as they search for clues and expose the ugly truth behind a suburban sex scandal fueled by more than just passion.
This was all about money and greed.
I couldn't get my mind wrapped around it. I thought this stuff only happened in the movies.
May 9th, 2001. It was a peaceful spring morning in beautiful Palm Beach, Florida, when police received a frantic call from a local woman named Kathy Stanek Cousins, who told them her husband Sean was missing.
The report given by Mrs. Cousin was that she hadn't seen her husband in several days.
Kathy told them that Sean was a pilot for Jamaica Airlines and had been scheduled for a flight 2 days ago. But he never checked in.
He hadn't shown up for work, which is very unusual.
He misses a flight, and that's kind of a problem when you're a pilot.
Kathy explained that she and Sean had gotten into a fight the night before he was supposed to fly. So when he stormed out of the house, she assumed he was simply going to the airport.
According to her, he walked out. That was the last time she saw him.
She thought that, okay, he took off and he's going to go straight to Miami to make his flight.
However, Kathy told police that when she checked their closet, she found that he'd left his uniform and passport behind. Kathy said Sean had been suffering from depression, so when almost 48 hours passed without hearing from him, she was afraid something bad might have happened. A fear that grew when Kathy discovered something else that was missing.
When Sean left the house, he took the cash from his last paycheck and Kathy's .45 pistol.
Investigators wondered if Sean Cousins was planning to take his own life. Was it possible that he was still alive? And if he was, where was he? Kathy Stanek was born in Chicago, Illinois, to loving parents. Growing up, Kathy was an inquisitive child who craved adventure. And her first opportunity to travel would come when her family relocated to sunny Palm Beach, Florida. But the city's beaches and nightlife weren't enough for young Kathy. She wanted to see more of the world. And she finally got a chance to satisfy her wanderlust after high school, when she landed a job as a flight attendant for Jamaica Airlines.
Air Jamaica at the time was a huge and popular airline in South Florida. Pilots often, they were really well paid.
And it didn't take Kathy long to catch the eye of one of the airline's handsome young pilots, 29-year-old Sean Cousins.
Sean was this good-looking guy in a pilot's uniform, flying to Jamaica every week and making a lot of money doing it.
She was a beautiful woman. He was attracted to her intensely, and, their relationship started.
Kathy and Sean felt an instant connection that quickly led to romance. There was only one problem. Sean was a married man.
He told Kathy his marriage was basically over, but that it was a complicated situation.
He may have been in the process of divorce, but he wasn't just free. He had 5 children.
Although Kathy knew the adulterous affair was wrong, she'd already fallen in love with Sean and took him at his word that he was in the process of a divorce. As far as she was concerned, she'd met the man of her dreams and was willing to do anything to be with him.
This man seemed like a dream come true. He was a pilot. He probably talked about all his travels, and she felt she was going to have a life of adventure and excitement.
Kathy's persistence eventually paid off. After a few years of seeing each other in secret, Sean's divorce was finalized. He and Kathy were married days later.
Once Sean decided he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Kathy, he didn't waste any time getting started.
And the newlyweds began their new life together in style. Sean bought Kathy an expensive home in the gated community of Palm Beach Gardens. Sean's salary meant Kathy no longer had to work full-time as a flight attendant. Instead, she took a job at a flower shop, planning to travel with Sean whenever his schedule allowed.
There's some glamour in that life, and your spouse is going to great cities, but she wasn't going with him all the time, obviously.
But Kathy soon discovered that being a pilot's wife wasn't everything she'd hoped it would be.
The reality set in that she was alone a lot. He's traveling, she's by herself. It wasn't this romantic picture that she had at the beginning.
Kathy found herself spending most of her time alone and lonely. And whenever Sean did come home, it seemed all he wanted from Kathy was quick sex before he left again on another trip. All of the romance had completely drained out of their relationship.
Kathy was feeling neglected. I'm by myself and I'm lonely, and maybe she's feeling not pretty enough anymore.
Kathy began to resent the way Sean was treating her, but she wasn't quite ready to give up the life of privilege being a pilot's wife provided.
She felt trapped in a marriage where she couldn't get out of it. She wanted to go out and have a good time.
Kathy didn't know what she was going to do, but in the meantime, she was in desperate need of love, affection, and most of all, excitement. And she would find all three in the strong arms of her handsome next-door neighbor. Timothy Koile was a 34-year-old cable company employee from Chicago, Illinois, who'd relocated to Palm Beach with his wife, Deborah, a few months before.
My mom moved 5 minutes away from us, and we just kind of like had a nice little family and relationship going.
But that would all change when Sean and Kathy Cousins moved in across the street. The two young couples quickly discovered they had a lot in common.
They invited us over to have drinks by the pool, and they grilled, or they would come and, over to our house, just neighbors once in a while getting together.
But with Sean's frequent flights taking him away from home, Kathy spent more and more time alone with their new friends.
Kathy goes over there when Sean's away and gets to know Tim and his wife.
Kathy immediately liked Tim. He was handsome and funny, and he was incredibly charming. It wasn't long before Kathy realized she had a crush on her new neighbor, though she tried her best to ignore it. But Kathy was also bored and lonesome, feeling she couldn't help but share with Tim and Deborah one night over wine.
She proceeds to tell them just how lonely she is in that house all by herself.
Kathy confessed she felt scared to be left home alone, sometimes for days at a time, while Sean was on a trip. So being a good neighbor, Tim made Kathy a friendly offer.
Tim said, well, if you ever need anything, if something happens, you could always just, call us. We're right across the street.
But as the night wore on, Kathy noticed the way Tim was watching her, and she began to suspect there was more to his offer than just a neighborly gesture, even though Tim's wife didn't pick up on the signals.
I guess I was really naive because I didn't suspect anything was going on. I was so in denial. I didn't want to believe that was happening.
After that night, Kathy couldn't stop thinking about Tim. And a few days later, when his wife was running errands, Kathy took Tim up on his offer to keep her company. Once they were alone, neither could resist the temptation to give in to the passion they both felt for one another. But one stolen afternoon of lust wouldn't be enough. Kathy and Tim began having an impassioned affair. But the couple's bond wasn't just sexual. Kathy was becoming obsessed with Tim. Unlike Sean, Tim made Kathy feel both wanted and needed.
She had this neighbor flattering her, and she found that exciting. That was the appeal.
I mean, how sexy does that sound? She has this great guy who's always there for her. He's not flying away like her husband.
Tim was just as consumed with Kathy. And living right next door, the lovers were able to continue their clandestine love affair, with his wife none the wiser.
They live across the street. He could go there and come home again, and his wife might not even realize where he's been.
However, keeping the affair a secret from Kathy's husband, Sean, was a different story. After getting the affection and excitement she'd been missing with Sean, Kathy couldn't bring herself to have sex with him anymore. And after Kathy turned him down a few times, Sean became suspicious.
At some point, he thought maybe she was having an affair. He got some signs, he got suspicious, and he was probably hoping that it was false.
So one morning, Sean decided to put his theory to the test. He lied to Kathy about his schedule and told her he was leaving on a flight. A couple of hours later, he returned home to find her in the arms of her lover, Tim Coyle.
He popped up unexpectedly, and there she was with the neighbor.
Coming up, investigators wonder whether finding out about his wife's affair had driven Sean to take desperate action.
They've got to be wondering if his talk about suicide wasn't just talk after all.
And as the search for the missing pilot continues, police make a disturbing discovery.
A body was found in an isolated part of Osceola County in a creek.
Kathy Stanek Cousins was a desperate housewife struggling with the lonely reality of being married to a pilot, until she found solace in the arms of her handsome and charming next-door neighbor, Tim Coyle.
The relationship was very hot and sensual. The sex is exciting.
But their secret affair had been overshadowed by the sudden disappearance of Kathy's husband, Sean. Sean had been scheduled for a flight, but he'd never checked in. And after 48 hours passed with no sign of Sean, Kathy had called the Palm Beach Police Department to file a missing persons report. Kathy explained that her marriage to Sean had been in trouble for months. His prolonged absences had caused them to grow apart, and whenever he came home, they'd wind up getting into a fight.
Their fights were usually about sex. He'd show up and want her to put out, and she expected intimacy.
I'm not a let's have sex with you kind of person. I'd rather much more make love. I sort of feel like a prostitute with my husband.
And Kathy said the problem in their marriage only got worse when Sean found out she'd been having an affair.
He popped up unexpectedly, and there she was with the neighbor. He saw enough to get furious.
Kathy told police she felt terrible about cheating on her husband and immediately ended the affair with Tim. She wanted to reconcile with Sean, and the two of them promised to work on their relationship.
He hands me a note. I realize what I've done to you, and I realize I've mistreated you. I realize I've been not there for you. I love you. I need you. I can't live without you.
But fixing their marriage was easier said than done. Sean's sexual demands continued to make Kathy feel used, and no matter how hard she tried to please him, he didn't trust her not to cheat on him again. Kathy said things had built up to another big fight the Friday before Sean disappeared.
If he doesn't get his gratification through the sex, then you better look out, because the whole world's in trouble if he starts arguing, yelling, screaming, whatever.
Kathy said their fight continued the rest of the weekend until things finally came to a head on Monday night, and his mood swung suddenly from anger to depression.
And he starts bitching and moaning about how he can't live this way. I don't want him. He doesn't want to be alive.
Kathy told police that Sean stormed out of the house, and she didn't hear from him again until he called around 1:30 a.m.
Sean tells Kathy if she won't take care of him, he's going to find somebody who will.
Because I'm going to find a girl in the bar, and if not, I'll go pay a prostitute. I said, okay, and he hung up on me.
Kathy said she hadn't thought much of her husband's threats at the time. Sean had often said things just to upset her. But when she found out that Sean never showed up for his flight the next morning, she realized something was wrong. Kathy said she called Sean's ex-wife and family, hoping they'd heard from him, but they were just as worried as she was.
They had not heard from him, which was unusual. Even when he goes away on trips, he would touch base with them.
At this point, they're wondering if something happened to him.
And when Kathy discovered that Sean had taken one of their handguns with him, she was afraid he might be intending to take his own life.
When Sean left the house, he took Kathy's .45 pistol. They've got to be wondering if his talk about suicide wasn't just talk after all.
Palm Beach police put out a bolo alert for Sean Cousins. Sean's loved ones prayed he was just in a hotel somewhere recovering from his fight with Kathy. But a call from Osceola County Police would confirm their worst fears. On May 11, a teenage boy was working on a highway road crew in rural Osceola County, Florida. Deciding to take a break, the teen broke off from the crew and walked down an embankment to a nearby creek, where he noticed something floating in the water. It was the body of a man.
He was face down in the water, arms extended out.
Horrified, the teen immediately called 911, and Osceola County sheriffs rushed to the scene. The body belonged to an unidentified middle-aged man, and from the state of decomposition, it appeared he had been floating in the creek for several days.
His shirt tail was neatly tucked in. Didn't seem like he was any kind of struggle. So we were thinking maybe one of the locals fell in the water, possibly drowned.
But it was soon clear that the victim's death had been anything but accidental.
The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head.
The body was so badly mangled that police believed at first that they would not be able to make a positive identification. But when investigators searched the man's clothes, they found a wallet containing a driver's license and credit cards.
The driver's license found on the body belonged to 34-year-old Sean Cousins.
When he run his driver's license, we find out he is a missing person out of Palm Beach County.
When the Osceola County sheriffs contacted Palm Beach detectives, they learned that Sean was last seen leaving his home 4 days earlier, on his way to Miami, an hour south of Palm Beach. And from the gunshot wound to his head, it appeared Sean may have followed through on his suicide threat after all.
Maybe he decides to drive out in the middle of nowhere and shoot himself.
Kathy was devastated by the news of her husband's death. But what neither she nor detectives could understand was why would Sean go all the way out to rural Osceola County to kill himself?
It's 100 miles away from where he said he was. He could have driven there, but where's his car?
With little else to go on, detectives hoped an autopsy might shed some more light on what happened to Sean. And in addition to the bullet wound found in Sean's head, the medical examiner discovered something that investigators on the scene hadn't noticed.
As the coroner is examining the body, she notices a second bullet wound in Sean's back.
Which meant Sean's death wasn't a suicide, it was murder. Coming up, investigators learned that Kathy and Sean's marriage was in more trouble than Kathy let on.
Numerous times the family would say that they would see Sean with scratch marks or bruises.
And the affair between Kathy and Tim might not have been over after all.
That further raises the police's suspicions that something is up here.
For months, Kathy Stanek Cousins and Tim Koile had been cheating on their spouses in an obsessive neighborhood affair. But their secret romance had been overshadowed by tragedy. When Kathy's husband Sean was found shot to death in a rural creek 100 miles away.
The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head.
When Sean disappeared a few days earlier, he'd taken a handgun with him, and Kathy feared he may be intending to commit suicide. But an autopsy revealed cause of death had been no accident.
The autopsy showed that there were 2 bullet wounds, one in the head and one in the stomach. And that's obviously a tip-off that there was some type of a homicide.
With their missing persons case turning into a murder, the Palm Beach police investigation kicked into high gear. But who would want Sean Cousins dead? The victim's spouse is often the first person homicide detectives look into. And in this case, the revelation that Kathy had been having an affair with the next-door neighbor made them especially interested in speaking with her again. And when police matched the slugs from Sean's body to Kathy's missing .45 caliber handgun, she began to look like an even more likely suspect. But when detectives contacted Kathy, she insisted that she had nothing to do with his death. She said they were working hard to reconcile and had even gone on a few dates days before he went missing.
While we were waiting for our table, we walked through the store, and they have all those like really cute little cards and stuff. I had picked them out. And I'm sorry for the way I've been. I'm sorry for the way I've treated you. I realize I've ruined the love you had for me. I love you.
The cards Kathy showed investigators confirmed her story. And when police spoke to Sean's mother, she agreed that her son seemed desperate to make the marriage work, against her own advice.
Sean did not want to get divorced, even though people told him, end this marriage, it's not good anymore. I guess he really loved her.
But if Kathy and Sean were both trying to save their marriage, then who else might have wanted him dead? Police didn't have very far to look, since Kathy's affair made her former lover Tim Koile the next logical suspect. But when detectives went next door to talk to Tim, he denied having anything to do with Sean's death.
He seems more concerned about his wife finding out that he's sleeping with the neighbor.
He was still denying it, and that he was just trying to be her friend. She just lost a husband. He was just brutally killed, and I was supposed to be this, sympathetic neighbor.
However, Tim did have a theory as to what might have happened to Sean Cousins. He told police there were rumors that the Jamaican Airlines pilot had been using his international flights to smuggle drugs. Police investigated Sean's flight records looking for any indication of illegal activity, but were unable to come up with anything to suggest Sean had been the victim of a drug deal gone wrong. Hoping to find new leads, detectives went to Sean's first wife and family, and what they had to tell police was eye-opening. Apparently, before his death, Sean had confided in them that his marriage to Kathy was even rockier than she'd admitted to police.
There was very many incidents told to me by the family where there was altercations between Sean and Kathy.
And according to Sean's family, Sean had told them that Kathy was always the one who assaulted him.
When she would get upset, she would actually attack Sean. Numerous times the family would say that they would see Sean with scratch marks or bruises.
Sean's family told detectives that the biggest fight of all had taken place the day Sean had come home early to catch Kathy and Tim together.
Sean came home and found Tim in the house. He tells Tim to leave the house. Tim refuses because he says, I'm here as a guest of Kathy, not of you. And then an altercation occurs between the two.
The two men had begun fighting, and that's when Kathy went and grabbed a gun from her bedroom and ordered Sean to leave her lover alone.
That only makes Sean angrier. There's a big standoff, and she tries to hold him off while she calls 911.
At some point, she hands the gun over to Tim to keep it on Sean while she's on the phone with the sheriff's office.
Sean was arrested for assault. Kathy quickly dropped the charges, but the damage had already been done. Sean's family told investigators that the incident had only made things between Sean and Kathy worse, and they were afraid that this time she might have finally gone through with her threat to kill him. Armed with this new information, police paid Kathy a visit, but she flatly denied the family's accusations and made it clear she had no interest in assisting in their investigation.
When we meet her, she's in the company of an attorney, and at that point, the attorney plainly told us that she would not be talking to us.
Although Kathy was completely within her rights, detectives were surprised by her sudden change in attitude. Now, instead of a grieving widow, she looked more like a woman with something to hide.
A wife who loved her husband should be willing to talk to the police till the end of time to get to the bottom of this.
Kathy may not have been willing to help with the investigation, but when police canvassed the neighborhood, they finally got the break they've been looking for. A neighbor claimed she'd heard gunshots coming from the cousin's home on the night of the murder.
This alleged witness claimed that she heard gunshots in the middle of the night, which would have been the time that the alleged crime occurred.
The time of the gunshots matched the coroner's estimated time of death, which was enough for police to secure a warrant to search the cousin's home.
They thoroughly inspected the victim's home, and if there were 2 gunshots fired at close range, you would expect to find some evidence of that.
But they were unable to find any traces of violence. Investigators seemed to have hit a dead end. There was no physical evidence linking Kathy or Tim to Sean's death. But letters and emails recovered in the search of the cousin's home suggested that Kathy and Tim's affair might not have ended after all. They found numerous love letters and emails between the two, making it sound like Kathy was still very much in love with Tim.
She wanted to be with him and only him. She was tired of playing the happy little wife and wanted it resolved.
They were madly in love and were making plans to be together. So that further raises the police's suspicions. Wait a minute, something is up here.
The lovers' emails also contain links to websites that show Tim Koile thought of himself as much more than just a mild-mannered satellite installer.
We found a website where he painted himself as Major Tim Koile, and he was experienced in urban warfare.
He considered himself a mercenary, that he was out to do whatever needed to be done in order to get the mission done.
However, detectives found no record of Tim Koile holding a rank in any of these armed services. It seemed Tim was little more than a daydreamer role-playing on the internet.
He wanted to portray himself that he was a badass, so to speak.
Just painting himself somebody he was not.
But was it possible that Tim had decided to make his mercenary fantasies a reality? Could he have killed Sean in an attempt to have Kathy all to himself? Coming up, new evidence suggests a possible motive for the murder.
The insurance policy went from $500,000 to $1 million.
Kathy Stanek cousins and Tim Koile were 2 neighbors in the throes of an impassioned, adulterous affair. But when Kathy's husband Sean was found murdered, she and Tim had graduated from cheating spouses to possible murder suspects. Of particular interest to police was Tim's secret internet persona, where he billed himself as a deadly soldier of fortune.
He considered himself a mercenary. He was out to do whatever needed to be done.
But did that include killing his lover's husband? To find out, police decided to take a closer look at Tim Koile, and they learned some suspicious information when they spoke with his wife, Deborah. Apparently, just a few days after Sean Cousin's murder, Tim had called his wife in a panic.
He had taken my van, and he told me he was buying pool chemicals. And so he calls me up, freaking out that chlorine spilled and that he has to rip the carpeting out of my brand new van.
Tim told Deborah he was taking the van to a local dealership to have the carpets replaced. Deborah agreed. But when the repair technician opened the back of the van, they immediately noticed something strange.
Carpet is gone, which they say usually people that want to replace their carpet, they don't tear the carpet up, they let the people do it.
And in the floorboards, the dealership technician discovered something even more troubling.
They also found traces of what appeared to be bloodstains.
That just was not sitting well with the dealership, and they called the police.
Palm Beach police immediately dispatched a team of forensic specialists to take the van into evidence and conduct a thorough search. They collected samples of blood found on the floorboards of the van and sent them to the crime lab for testing.
they were able to determine that the blood in that automobile was in fact the blood of Sean Cousins.
For detectives, the blood evidence was a major step forward in the case against Tim Koile.
It put Sean Cousins in that van, either hurt, bleeding, or somewhere where his blood was transferred to.
But while blood splatter proved that Sean had been inside of Tim's van, it wasn't enough to prove that Tim had committed the murder. Police needed more evidence before they could make an arrest, and they found it in Tim's cell phone records. With the help of Tim's service provider, detectives were able to track Tim's whereabouts on the day Sean Cousins had disappeared.
That cell phone acts like a GPS. So that was giving us a timeline where he was at what particular time.
And the GPS map created by Tim's phone showed that on that day, Tim had driven from Sean and Kathy's house all the way to the exact creek where Sean Cousins' body had been found.
They could now actually prove that Tim Koile drove the body after the murder from West Palm Beach to Osceola County and dumped it.
Detectives knew the cell phone evidence, combined with the traces of blood, was enough to put Tim Koile behind bars. But before making any arrests, they wanted to determine how much Kathy knew and whether she was involved as well.
Has she just been covering for Tim, or was she a part of this?
Once again, Tim's cell phone records provided a clue investigators hoped would unravel the rest of the story.
A number was being called up north to Chicago, right around that time frame where we suspect maybe the homicide occurred.
The phone number belonged to a friend of Tim's back in Chicago, a fellow self-styled soldier of fortune named Daniel Bakovic. Like Tim, Daniel billed himself on the internet as a deadly mercenary for hire. And in addition to their phone calls, the two men had also exchanged a chain of suspicious emails in the weeks leading up to Sean Cousins' murder.
There was some communication to Daniel Bakovic. I have a mission we have to do, just kind of like code for maybe what's really happening, and that's to cover up a homicide.
Detectives traveled to Chicago to find out what Daniel Bakovic had to say, and discovered he was more than willing to talk.
When we got there, he kind of said, hey, I figured someone would be finally contacting me about what's happened in Florida.
Daniel confirmed that Tim had tried to contract him to kill Sean Cousins. But Tim wasn't the one who was supposed to pay him. Kathy was.
Kathy's going to give him $500,000 after she cashes out her husband's $1 million life insurance policy.
It appeared the lovers had been just as motivated by greed as their obsessive love affair when they plotted to kill Sean Cousins.
$1 million is a lot of money, and that would be a motive for somebody to receive $1 million by killing someone.
Daniel told investigators that the plan was for him to ambush Sean while he and Kathy were at the movies.
Daniel Bakovic was supposed to kill Sean and made it look like a robbery.
But when it came time to fly to Florida, Daniel decided not to go through with it. He said he'd expected to receive an angry call from Tim, but didn't hear from him until more than 24 hours later, on the night of Sean Cousins' murder.
About 2:16 in the morning, Tim Koile contacted him, and on the phone, and he's kind of excited. He says, I can't believe she did it. And I need you down here now. And he's like, what are you talking about? And then all of a sudden, he abruptly said, I'll call you back.
Tim never called back. But Daniel had assumed that the she Tim was referring to was Kathy Stanek Cousins. And she'd gotten tired of waiting for Daniel to show up and kill Sean.
That's what he interpreted, that it was Kathy who had killed Sean Cousins.
Between the evidence of the undying love affair between Kathy and Tim, the blood traces found in Tim's car, and the testimony of Daniel Bakovic, detectives had enough to arrest the lovers for the murder of Sean Cousins. But even behind bars, Kathy and Tim both continued to claim their innocence. And with no direct physical evidence tying Kathy to the crime, investigators knew their best shot at convictions was to get the lovers to turn on one another. They decided to try their luck with Tim first.
They had a stronger case against Tim. They had the blood in the van. They had some of his email correspondence to the mercenary up in Chicago.
Sensing he was poised to take the fall for the murder, Tim finally cracked and agreed to cut a deal with prosecutors.
We spoke to the prosecutor, and Mr. Koile decided that it was in his best interest to perhaps take an offer from the state.
Tim agreed to plead guilty to a 10-year manslaughter charge in exchange for his testimony against Kathy Cousins.
With his plea deal in place, Tim confessed that he and Kathy had enlisted Daniel Bakovic's help in killing Sean. Their reason, to get Kathy's husband out of the picture so he and Kathy could finally be together.
We know now that was the motive. Her wanting to live the rest of her life with Tim. Sean's out of the way, and they've got $1 million policy.
But when Daniel didn't follow through with their plan, Kathy had gotten impatient, as Tim discovered after receiving an urgent text message later that night.
It's from Kathy, and it just says for him to come over quick.
Tim said he rushed over to Kathy's house and found her in the garage. She was standing over Sean with a gun.
Sean had been shot in the stomach and was bleeding.
Tim said Kathy tried to get him to finish the job. But despite Tim's claims of being a mercenary, he said he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger.
She gave him the gun to finish it off, but he chickened out.
However, Kathy had no problem doing it herself.
Mrs. Cousins shot her husband in the head.
Tim told police that at first, he was horrified to witness Sean's murder. But he also realized that Kathy had done what they both agreed was necessary. She'd killed Sean to keep their love alive. And as his adrenaline kicked in, his shock quickly turned to lust.
Sean was dying or dead in the garage. They had wine, and then they had celebration sex, and this is the people that they were dealing with there.
Tim could have called the police, but instead, they both chose to be sexual together. It was like sealing their fate together. They were partners in this crime.
They were cementing and solidifying the fact that they could finally be together without any interruption. But it is the sickest way to do that.
And after the couple made love, Tim said they loaded Sean's body into Tim's van.
They drove until they found a desolate area where no one would hopefully find the body, and that's where they dumped it.
It was a shocking story, and fit with the circumstantial evidence the prosecutors had already assembled against the couple. But would Tim's testimony alone be enough to convict Kathy? Or would the lack of hard proof against the cheating widow lead to her acquittal? Coming up, as Kathy's murder trial gets underway, the state's case looks like it may crumble under scrutiny.
They didn't find any forensics. They didn't have the weapon. All they had was the wife having an affair.
When Kathy Stanek Cousins fell in love with her handsome next-door neighbor, Tim Koile, she thought she'd finally found the passion and excitement that had been missing from her life. But the clandestine affair had come to a shocking end when Tim confessed to helping Kathy kill her husband. And she found herself on the hook for murder. On May 19, 2003, Kathy's murder trial began. Prosecutors argued she'd killed her husband for both love and greed.
She wanted $1 million of life insurance proceeds. She wanted to get rid of her husband, and she sought to accomplish both in one fell swoop.
Kathy's defense insisted that the state couldn't prove their charge of first-degree murder. They had no hard evidence to prove Tim's story that Kathy shot and killed her husband in their garage.
So it would have been some type of blood splatter, even a tiny amount. Forensics would have picked it up. So they didn't have that. They didn't have the weapon. All they had was the wife having an affair.
But the state believed that Tim's willingness to implicate himself in the murder proved he was telling the truth.
From the defense perspective, we will argue that their truth is whatever they need to find somebody guilty. I think in this case, they had to make an evaluation. Did his testimony, was it consistent with the physical evidence that they did have and the circumstantial evidence that they did have, and they ultimately made the call that it did.
Throughout the trial, Kathy appeared calm and confident until her lover was called to the stand.
I'm sure it was devastating for her. Tim sort of lives up to his own created persona. He treated this love affair as a mercenary would. You know, he put himself first and sold Kathy out.
The jury hung on every word as Tim Koile described Sean's desperate final moments, as well as the lusty celebration that followed his murder.
His testimony just tied up the whole case and gave the jury an eyewitness account in very graphic terms.
It left little room for the jury to see Kathy as anything more than a cold-blooded killer who showed no remorse. But as the jury deliberated, Tim's plea bargain gave them cause for concern. He would only spend 10 years in prison, which left them reluctant to give his co-conspirator a more severe sentence.
The jury knows that he's going to get X amount, and they may feel, why should we give her that much more? So I believe that's what they took into consideration.
So instead of first-degree murder, they shocked everyone by finding Kathy guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter.
She got 15 years in prison.
It was a surprisingly light sentence for those who believed Kathy had executed her husband in cold blood. And while his killers had been brought to justice, Sean Cousin's family believed Kathy deserved a stronger punishment for committing the ultimate act of betrayal.
The family wanted to see Kathy go away for life for orchestrating such a heinous crime.
It's crossing a line. It's just letting your emotions take over and not worrying about the consequences in that moment.
In the end, Kathy's passion and greed destroyed more than just one life. It also destroyed the lives of everyone around her. A harsh reality that Tim's ex-wife, Deborah Koile, has to face every day.
I loved him, but I was betrayed by him. You know, I remember the man that I thought I married, that I loved, and that wasn't him. If she never came into our lives, none of this obviously would have happened.
In the forests of Calaveras County, California, there was a piece of land that appeared ordinary from the outside. It was remote, quiet, and far away from the attention of most people. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear and where questions could remain unanswered for a long time. But beneath that isolation, investigators would later discover evidence connected to one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in California history. The property near Wilseyville would become known not because of what happened in public, but because of what was hidden away from the world. It became the center of a case involving missing people, secret plans, stolen identities, and two men whose names would become permanently associated with fear and uncertainty: Leonard Thomas Lake and Charles Chi-Tat-ing. Between 1983 and 1985. These two men were accused of creating a system of kidnapping and murder that investigators believe claimed the lives of at least 11 confirmed victims, with the possibility that many more people may have been lost without ever being identified. But before this became a story about suspects, evidence, and courtrooms, it began as something much more personal: people disappearing, families waiting for answers, and investigators trying to understand how several seemingly unrelated disappearances could be connected. The case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng is often remembered because of the crimes attributed to them. But at its center are the victims, ordinary people whose lives were interrupted and whose families were left searching for explanations. Their names became part of a criminal investigation, but before that, they were individuals with relationships, families, and futures that were taken away. The first signs of the tragedy appeared through disappearances that seemed isolated. A missing person report here, a vehicle found there, a family that suddenly vanished. At first, there was no clear picture of a larger pattern. There was no obvious connection between the people who had disappeared. But over time, investigators began to uncover pieces of information that suggested something far more serious was happening. A vehicle belonging to a missing person. Personal belongings connected to someone who had vanished. Documents that appeared to belong to people who were no longer alive. Slowly, the investigation began moving toward one location and two individuals. The property near Wilseyville became the place where investigators believed many of the answers were hidden. Leonard Lake was not simply viewed as someone who had committed spontaneous acts of violence. Investigators believed he had spent years developing a worldview built around survival, control, and domination. His writings and personal materials revealed a disturbing fantasy that he called Operation Miranda, a plan based on his belief that society could collapse and that he would need to create his own controlled environment to survive. What began as fantasy, according to investigators, became connected to real criminal actions. Lake's ideas reflected a dangerous belief that other human beings could be treated as objects rather than individuals with rights and lives of their own. Charles Ng entered this picture as a younger man whose relationship with Lake would become one of the most important questions in the investigation. Prosecutors later argued that Lake was the planner and the person who developed the ideas behind the crimes, while Ng was an active participant who assisted him. Ng, however, would later attempt to separate himself from responsibility, arguing that Lake was the driving force and that he had been influenced by him. The legal question of Ng's exact role would eventually become the focus of one of the most complex trials in California history. But before the courtroom battles, before the legal arguments, and before the evidence was presented to a jury, there were people whose lives had already been changed forever. Among the confirmed victims connected to the case was Charles Chuck Gunner, a man who had known Leonard Lake personally. Gunner was not a stranger to Lake. He had been a friend and had even served as the best man at Lake's wedding. His connection to Lake made his disappearance especially significant because it suggested that the crimes were not limited to unknown individuals. People within Lake's own circle could also become victims. Another case involved the Dubbs family, Harvey Dubbs, his wife Deborah, and their one-year-old son Sean. Their disappearance in 1984 brought another level of tragedy to the investigation because an entire family had vanished. The disappearance of a child alongside his parents created unanswered questions that investigators would carry throughout the case. For the people who loved them, the absence of information became its own form of suffering. There were no clear explanations, no immediate answers, and no certainty about what had happened. Paul Costner was another victim whose disappearance became a critical part of the investigation. A 39-year-old automobile business owner, Costner disappeared in 1984. The discovery that his Honda Prelude was connected to Leonard Lake became one of the important clues that helped investigators understand that these disappearances might not be separate events. The vehicle was not just a piece of property. It represented a connection between a missing person and a suspect. Later, investigators also connected the case to Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor, their young son, and Robin Stapley. Their disappearance in 1985 became part of the final group of victims identified in connection with the Wilseyville property. Each disappearance represented a person who had once been present in the lives of others. Each missing name represented someone who had family members, friends, and people who wanted answers. The investigation would eventually focus on Lake and Ng, but the human cost existed long before either man entered a courtroom. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was the belief among investigators that the confirmed victims might not represent the full extent of what happened. Evidence discovered at the property suggested that additional victims may have existed. However, without complete records, identifiable remains, or enough evidence to prove individual cases, many questions remained unanswered. The possibility of more victims became one of the enduring mysteries of the investigation. The story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng is therefore not only about a criminal partnership. It is about the difficult process of reconstructing the truth after so much had been hidden. It is about investigators attempting to piece together evidence after one of the central figures was no longer available to answer questions. It is about a justice system trying to determine responsibility when the evidence came from a complicated and disturbing crime scene. And most importantly, it is about remembering that behind every investigation file, every piece of evidence, and every courtroom argument, there were human beings whose lives mattered. The case began with silence, with people who were gone and no immediate explanation for why. But as investigators followed the evidence, that silence began to reveal a much darker story. The remote land near Wilseyville would eventually become the place where those questions came together, where the hidden evidence was uncovered, and where the names of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng became connected forever to one of California's most haunting criminal cases. Before the investigation into Leonard Lake and Charles Ng became one of California's most infamous criminal cases, there were individual lives that existed far away from the headlines. The people connected to this case were not simply names written in police reports or evidence files. They were individuals with families, friendships, responsibilities, and futures that were interrupted. Understanding this case requires looking beyond the two men accused of these crimes and recognizing the people who disappeared, because the story did not begin with the suspects. It began with the victims and the unanswered questions left behind. Among the earliest names connected to the investigation was Charles "Chuck" Gunner. Unlike many of the other victims associated with the case, Gunner was not a stranger who crossed paths with Leonard Lake by chance. He was someone who knew him personally. Gunner had been Lake's friend and had even served as the best man at Lake's wedding. That connection would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the investigation. The idea that someone within Lake's own personal circle could become a victim demonstrated how difficult it was to understand the boundaries of his actions. The relationship between Lake and Gunner showed investigators that familiarity did not necessarily provide protection. A person who knew Lake, trusted him, and had been part of his life could still become connected to the crimes being investigated. As investigators examined the growing number of disappearances, another case stood out because it involved not one person, but an entire family. In 1984, Harvey Dubbs, his wife Deborah, and their one-year-old son Sean disappeared. The disappearance of the Dubbs family created a particularly painful mystery. When an entire family vanishes, the questions become even more urgent. There is no single person who can provide answers, no immediate explanation for where they went, and no simple way to understand what happened. For those who knew the family, the disappearance represented a sudden absence that changed their lives. Investigators later connected the disappearance of the Dubbs family to Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, adding another layer of seriousness to the case. The fact that a young child was among the missing victims made the investigation even more tragic. The disappearance of the Dubbs family was not simply another missing persons case. It represented the loss of an entire family unit and the uncertainty experienced by those left behind. Another victim connected to the investigation was Paul Costner, a 39-year-old automobile business owner. Costner disappeared in 1984 after becoming linked to circumstances involving Leonard Lake. His disappearance became especially important because of the discovery of his Honda Prelude. The vehicle later became a key piece of evidence connecting Lake to the broader investigation. A missing persons vehicle can often become one of the most important clues in a criminal case, because it creates a physical link between the victim and the events that followed. In Costner's case, the vehicle helped investigators move closer to understanding that multiple disappearances might not be isolated incidents. Instead, they appeared to form part of a larger pattern connected to the same individuals. In 1985, investigators also connected the case to Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor, their young son, and Robin Stapley. Their disappearances represented another group of people whose lives became part of the Investigation into the Wilseyville property. Bond and O'Connor were not simply names in a case file. They were people who had relationships and personal histories before they disappeared. Their child represented another life affected by the events surrounding the case. Robin Stapley, who disappeared during the same period, became another name connected to the investigation. Together, these disappearances created a pattern that investigators struggled to understand until evidence began pointing toward Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. While the victims represented the human side of the investigation, the backgrounds of the two suspects provided insight into how the case developed. Leonard Thomas Lake was born on October 29, 1945, in San Francisco, California. His early life was described as unstable. After his parents divorced, Lake and his sister spent time living with their grandmother. As he grew older, Lake developed interests that would later become important to investigators trying to understand his mindset. He was described as isolated and fascinated by dark ideas involving violence, survival, and disaster. These interests became increasingly connected to a worldview centered around preparation for a catastrophic future. Lake developed a strong interest in survivalism, the belief that individuals should prepare for the collapse of society. He focused on ideas involving weapons, self-reliance, and surviving a world without normal social structures. On their own, interests in survival preparation do not indicate criminal behavior. However, investigators later examined how these ideas became connected to Lake's belief that he could create his own rules and control the lives of others. His military background also became part of the examination of his life. Lake joined the United States Marine Corps and developed further familiarity with survival skills, weapons, and military concepts. After leaving the military, he continued exploring survivalist ideas and became increasingly focused on creating a private environment away from society. Investigators believe that these beliefs eventually merged with a desire for control and power over other people. The most important evidence revealing Lake's thinking came from his personal writings. In these writings, Lake described what he called Operation Miranda. The plan represented a fantasy world where he imagined a future after social collapse and believed he needed to create a controlled environment for survival. Investigators later viewed these writings as important evidence because they showed that Lake's actions were not simply random. They suggested planning, preparation, and a long period of developing these ideas. The second major figure in the case was Charles Chi-Tat Ng. Ng was born on December 24, 1960, in Hong Kong. Unlike Lake, Ng came to the United States later in life. He moved to America for education, but his life soon became complicated by personal and legal difficulties. Ng experienced problems adapting and became involved in criminal activity. He joined the United States Marine Corps, but later faced accusations involving stolen military weapons. His legal troubles eventually contributed to his separation from the military. After meeting Leonard Lake, Ng became connected to the investigation that would define the rest of his life. Prosecutors later argued that Lake and Ng formed a partnership in which Lake created the ideas and plans while Ng directly assisted in carrying out crimes. The defense would later challenge this interpretation, arguing that Lake was the dominant figure and that Ng's responsibility was different from what prosecutors claimed. The relationship between the two men became one of the central questions of the case. However, before the courts could determine responsibility, investigators first had to uncover what had happened and identify the connection between the missing people. The victims and the backgrounds of the suspects created the foundation of the investigation. The disappearances showed the human impact of the case, while the histories of Lake and Ng provided investigators with a possible explanation for how these crimes could have occurred. But the full scale of the investigation would only become clear after authorities discovered what was hidden on the remote property near Wilseyville. What appeared to be an ordinary piece of land would soon become the center of a search for answers that had been missing for years. The investigation into Leonard Lake and Charles Ng eventually centered on a remote piece of property near Wilseyville, California. Before investigators arrived there, before evidence was collected, and before the location became connected to one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in the state's history, it existed as an isolated place away from the attention of the public. For Leonard Lake, however, the property represented something much more significant. According to investigators, it was not simply a home or a piece of land. It was a location where his private ideas about survival, control, and power could be transformed into reality. The connection between Lake's writings, the Wilseyville property, and the disappearances of multiple people became the foundation of the case against him and Charles Ng. The most important insight into Leonard Lake's thinking came from his personal writings, particularly the material connected to what he called Operation Miranda. These writings provided investigators with a window into the beliefs and fantasies that shaped Lake's actions. The name Operation Miranda was connected to a character from science fiction, reflecting Lake's fascination with imagined futures and survival scenarios. In his writings, Lake described a world in which society had collapsed and where he believed he would need to create his own controlled environment to survive. However, investigators believed that beneath the language of survival preparation was something far more disturbing, a belief that he had the right to control other people's lives. Lake's writings were significant because they suggested that his actions were not random or spontaneous. They showed a pattern of thinking that involved preparation and planning. Investigators believed that Lake had spent years developing these ideas, creating a mental framework in which his own desires became more important than the rights of others. The concept of survival became connected with domination, and the idea of preparing for the future became connected with taking control over people he viewed as part of his imagined world. The Wilseyville property became the physical location where investigators believed these ideas were carried out. Located in a remote area of Calaveras County, the property had characteristics that made it difficult for outsiders to notice what was happening there. It was away from crowded neighborhoods and offered privacy. For investigators examining the case after the fact, the isolation of the location became one of the important factors in understanding how the crimes could remain hidden. At the property, Lake and Ng were believed to have created a private area where they could keep control over their activities. Investigators later described discovering evidence that connected the location to missing people and to the crimes under investigation. Among the items found were personal belongings belonging to victims, weapons, videos, written materials, and other evidence that helped investigators reconstruct events. Each item became part of a larger effort to understand what had happened. A single object might not answer every question, but together, the evidence created a picture of a carefully prepared environment connected to a series of disappearances. One of the most important elements of the investigation was the belief that Lake and Ng did not choose victims randomly. Investigators believed that they targeted individuals who could disappear without immediately attracting widespread attention. This included people who were isolated, people connected to them personally, and individuals whose vehicles, documents, or identities could potentially be used. The use of personal information and property belonging to victims became an important part of understanding how the crimes were carried out. Investigators believed that Lake used stolen identities and possessions to hide connections between himself and those who had disappeared. This made the investigation more difficult because the evidence was not always immediately obvious. A missing person's vehicle or identification documents could initially appear unrelated to another person until investigators discovered the connection. The pattern became clearer only after multiple pieces of evidence were examined together. The crimes connected to Lake and Ng involved both planning and concealment. Investigators believed that men who became victims were often killed, while women were held captive for longer periods. The investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting that the perpetrators recorded some of their actions These recordings became among the most important and disturbing pieces of evidence collected. They provided investigators with information that could not be obtained through traditional witness testimony because many of the people who could have explained what happened were no longer alive. However, the existence of such evidence also reflected the level of preparation involved. It suggested that the crimes were not only acts of violence, but part of a larger system created by the offenders. The possibility of additional victims became one of the most difficult questions in the investigation. Authorities confirmed several victims connected to the case, but evidence discovered at the property suggested that the number of victims might have been higher. Investigators found indications that additional people may have been involved, but without enough evidence to identify every individual case, many questions remained unanswered. This uncertainty became one of the lasting mysteries surrounding Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. For families of missing people, the possibility that their loved ones could have been connected to the case created both hope and pain. Hope existed because there was a possibility that answers could finally be found. Pain existed because those answers often confirmed the worst possibilities. The investigation was not only about proving crimes, it was also about identifying victims and providing families with information about what had happened. As investigators examined the Wilseyville property, they began to understand the scale of what they were dealing with. The location represented a combination of several factors that made the case particularly complex. An isolated setting, a lack of immediate witnesses, missing victims, and evidence that required careful interpretation. Unlike a traditional investigation where a single event might reveal the truth quickly, this case required investigators to connect separate pieces of information over time. The property, the documents, the vehicles, and the personal belongings all became parts of a larger puzzle. The relationship between Leonard Lake and Charles Ng was another central element. Prosecutors later argued that the two men worked together, with Lake providing the ideas and planning, while Ng assisted in carrying out the crimes. Their partnership became one of the most important issues during the later trial. However, at the time of the investigation, authorities first had to determine the extent of their involvement and establish the connection between the suspects and the victims. The discovery of the evidence at Wilseyville changed the direction of the case. What had begun as a series of missing person investigations became something much larger. Investigators were no longer searching only for missing individuals. They were uncovering evidence of a possible organized pattern of kidnapping and murder. The property became the place where the hidden story began to emerge. Yet, even with the evidence discovered there, many questions remained. Leonard Lake was still alive at the time investigators first connected him to the crimes, but that would soon change. The person investigators believed held many of the answers would never face trial. His death would create a new challenge: how to prove the truth when one of the central figures was gone. The investigation would continue, but the path forward would depend on the evidence left behind and the search for Charles Ng, the other person believed to be responsible for what happened at Wilseyville. For a long time, the disappearances connected to Leonard Lake and Charles Ng remained separate mysteries. Families were left without answers. Investigators followed individual leads, and there was no clear explanation that connected all of the missing people together. The evidence that would eventually reveal the larger picture did not come from a planned police operation or a major breakthrough in an existing murder investigation. Instead, it began with something much smaller: a theft. A single incident in South San Francisco would set off a chain of events that would expose a hidden world connected to missing people, stolen identities, and a remote property in Calaveras County. On June 2, 1985, Charles Ng was caught stealing a metal tool from a store in South San Francisco. At the time, the incident appeared to be a simple property crime. There was no immediate indication that it would become connected to one of the most complex criminal investigations in California history. Ng attempted to flee after being confronted, leaving behind Leonard Lake and the vehicle they had been using. That decision would become the turning point of the entire case. When law enforcement examined the vehicle connected to Lake, They discovered information that raised serious questions. What appeared at first to be an ordinary investigation into theft began revealing connections to missing persons cases. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a firearm, documents connected to missing individuals, and evidence linking the vehicle itself to Paul Costner, a man who had disappeared in 1984. The discovery of Costner's Honda Prelude was especially important because it created a direct connection between a missing person and Leonard Lake. A vehicle belonging to someone who had vanished was no longer just a missing property report. It became evidence suggesting that something much more serious had occurred. Investigators also found information connected to another victim, increasing the possibility that Lake was involved in multiple disappearances rather than a single incident. The significance of the discovery was not only in what was found, but in what it suggested. Until this moment, several disappearances had existed as separate investigations. Now, investigators had a possible link between them. They had a suspect, evidence connected to missing people, and a reason to examine Lake's background more closely. The focus of the investigation quickly expanded. Leonard Lake became the central figure in a growing investigation. Authorities began examining his connection to the missing people and searching for additional evidence. The remote property near Wilseyville, California, became a major focus because of its connection to Lake and the information discovered during the investigation. As investigators searched the property, they found evidence that supported their belief that the location was connected to the disappearances. Among the materials recovered were personal belongings belonging to victims, weapons, videos, written documents, and other items connected to the investigation. Each discovery added another piece to a complicated puzzle. Investigators were not simply trying to prove that a crime had occurred. They were trying to reconstruct events, identify victims, and understand the relationship between Lake and Ng. One of the most significant discoveries was Leonard Lake's personal writings. These materials provided investigators with insight into his thoughts and plans. The writings connected to Operation Miranda became important because they showed a pattern of thinking that involved preparation and control. They suggested that Lake had developed ideas about survival and power long before investigators became involved. The documents helped prosecutors later argue that the crimes were planned rather than accidental. However, the investigation faced an immediate challenge. Leonard Lake would not be available to explain his actions. After his arrest, Lake was taken into custody and questioned by investigators. During the interrogation process, he swallowed a cyanide capsule that he had hidden on himself. He was taken to medical care, but his condition continued to deteriorate. On June 6, 1985, Leonard Lake died. His death created a major obstacle for investigators because the person they believed had created the plan and understood the full extent of the crimes was gone. There would be no trial where Lake could be questioned, no opportunity to compare his statements with the evidence, and no direct explanation from him about the events connected to Wilseyville. Instead, investigators had to rely on the evidence he left behind. The journals, videos, physical evidence, and connections between victims became the foundation of the case. The death of Lake changed the direction of the investigation. Rather than focusing on two suspects, authorities now had to build a case against the remaining person connected to the crimes, Charles Ng. But Ng was no longer in California. After Lake's death, Ng left the United States and traveled to Canada. His disappearance created another challenge for investigators. The person believed to have direct knowledge of the events at Wilseyville was now outside American jurisdiction. In July 1985, Ng was arrested in Calgary, Canada, following another theft incident. During his attempt to escape, he shot a security guard before being captured. This arrest would begin a lengthy legal process involving his return to California. The effort to bring Ng back to the United States became complicated. Ng fought extradition for years, raising legal arguments connected to the possibility of receiving the death penalty if convicted. The process delayed the trial and extended the investigation long after the discovery of the Wilseyville evidence. While Ng remained in Canada, California authorities continued preparing their case. They had to rely heavily on the evidence recovered after Lake's arrest and death. The challenge was significant because one of the central figures in the alleged crimes was no longer alive. Prosecutors needed to prove that Ng was not simply present around Lake, but that he had an active role in the crimes. This would become one of the main questions of the future trial. The evidence collected from Wilseyville became essential. The personal belongings of victims, the documents, the videos, and the connections between missing persons created the foundation of the prosecution's case. Investigators worked to establish a timeline and understand how the disappearances were connected. The process required examining every detail because the victims were no longer available to tell their own stories. Evidence had to speak for them. As the investigation continued, the scale of the case became clearer. Authorities believed they were dealing with more than a series of unrelated disappearances. They believed they had uncovered a pattern involving kidnapping, murder, and the use of a private location to hide crimes. The investigation also revealed the difficulty of solving cases where victims disappear without witnesses. Without the discovery of Lake's vehicle and the evidence connected to him, many of these disappearances might have remained unexplained. The case demonstrated how a single piece of evidence could change the direction of an entire investigation. The theft that led police to Leonard Lake was not connected to the missing persons cases on the surface. But once investigators examined the evidence, it became the doorway into a much larger story. The discovery of the vehicle, the search of the property, and the materials left behind by Lake transformed a collection of missing person reports into a major criminal investigation. Yet even with these discoveries, justice was still far away. Investigators still needed to bring Charles Ng back to California and prove his responsibility in court. The next chapter of the case would move from the forests of Wilseyville and the evidence rooms of investigators into a long legal battle that would determine whether Charles Ng would be held responsible for the crimes connected to Leonard Lake. The investigation into Leonard Lake and Charles Ng changed forever on June 6, 1985. Until that moment, authorities believed they had captured one of the central figures behind the crimes connected to the Wilseyville property. Leonard Lake was the person investigators believed could explain the full extent of what had happened. His writings, his connection to the missing victims, and the evidence discovered during the investigation suggested that he held critical information. But before the legal process could begin, before a complete account of the crimes could be presented in court, Lake made a decision that removed him from the investigation permanently. His death left investigators with a difficult task, finding the truth without the testimony of the person they believed had designed the operation. After his arrest, Leonard Lake was taken into custody and questioned by authorities. At that point, investigators were attempting to understand the connection between Lake Charles Ng and the missing people whose names had begun appearing throughout the investigation. They were also trying to determine how extensive the crimes were and how the evidence found in Lake's possession connected to the disappearances being examined. But during the questioning process, Lake swallowed a cyanide capsule that he had hidden. The act was unexpected and immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Lake became seriously ill and was transported for medical treatment. Despite efforts to save him, he died on June 6, 1985. His death meant that investigators lost the opportunity to question him further. They lost the possibility of hearing his explanation of the events, learning more about the identities of potential victims, or understanding the full scope of his relationship with Charles Ng directly from Lake himself. For investigators, the situation created a major challenge. The person they believed had planned the crimes could no longer be questioned in court. Any explanation of Lake's role would have to come from the evidence he left behind. The investigation, therefore, became a search through documents, physical evidence, and connections between missing people. The materials recovered during the investigation became even more important after Lake's death. Among the most significant evidence were his personal writings. These writings provided investigators with information about Lake's thoughts and his concept of Operation Miranda. The documents were important because they suggested that Lake had spent considerable time developing ideas related to survival, control, and the creation of a private world separate from normal society. Investigators viewed these writings as evidence that the events connected to Wilseyville were not simply the result of sudden actions. Instead, they suggested planning and preparation. The writings helped authorities understand how Lake viewed the world and how his beliefs may have influenced his actions. They also became important in building the case against Charles Ng because prosecutors would later argue that Ng had participated in a larger plan created by Lake. In addition to the written materials, investigators examined videos and physical evidence discovered during the search connected to the Wilseyville property. These items became central to reconstructing what had happened. Because many of the people connected to the case were missing or deceased, evidence had to replace the testimony that would normally come from victims or witnesses. Every object recovered became a potential link between a missing person and the suspects. Personal belongings helped investigators connect individuals to the property. Documents provided information about identities and relationships. Videos became evidence that prosecutors would later use in court. The process was not simple. Investigators had to carefully examine each piece of information and determine how it fit into the larger picture. The case involved multiple victims, uncertain timelines, and unanswered questions about how many people had actually been affected. The possibility of additional victims remained one of the most difficult parts of the investigation. Authorities confirmed several victims connected to Lake and Ng, but evidence suggested that the number could have been higher. Investigators believed that other people may have disappeared and that not every victim had been identified. However, without enough information to prove individual cases, many disappearances remained unresolved. This uncertainty added another layer of difficulty for families who were still searching for answers. For relatives of missing people, the investigation provided information but also created painful questions. Learning that a loved one might be connected to a criminal investigation could bring a form of closure, but it could also confirm fears that had existed for years. The investigation was not only about collecting evidence against suspects. It was also about identifying victims and restoring their identities. After Lake's death, attention turned increasingly toward Charles Ng. Prosecutors believed that Ng was not merely someone who happened to be connected to Lake, but an active participant in the crimes. However, proving that claim would require a careful presentation of evidence. Without Lake's testimony, authorities had to rely on the materials left behind and the connections they could establish through investigation. The case against Ng would depend on demonstrating his role based on evidence rather than statements from Lake. This created a difficult legal situation. In criminal cases, establishing responsibility requires more than showing that someone was associated with a suspect. Investigators and prosecutors needed to demonstrate that Ng had participated in specific criminal acts. The evidence from Wilseyville would become the foundation for that argument. While Lake's death prevented authorities from hearing his version of events, it did not erase the evidence associated with him. In some ways, his own materials became the source of information that investigators used to understand the case. The writings and physical evidence created a record of the ideas and actions that authorities believed connected him to the crimes. But questions remained. How many victims were there? How much responsibility belonged to Lake alone? How much did Ng know? And how directly did he participate? These questions would not be answered immediately. They would become central issues in the years ahead as prosecutors prepared their case against Ng. The death of Leonard Lake also changed the public understanding of the case. Before his death, investigators were dealing with two suspects. After his death, the investigation became a search for justice through the evidence left behind and through the prosecution of the surviving suspect. The disappearance of Lake did not end the investigation. Instead, it made the evidence more important than ever. The story of Wilseyville would not be told through a confession or a complete explanation from the person investigators believed was responsible. It would be reconstructed piece by piece through documents, objects, and the experiences of those affected. The investigation continued because the questions remained. The victims still needed to be identified. The families still deserved answers. And the legal system still needed to determine whether Charles Ng would be held responsible for his alleged role. The next stage of the case would focus on finding Ng, returning him to California, and preparing for one of the most complicated criminal trials in the state's history. After the death of Leonard Lake, the investigation into the Wilseyville crimes entered a new and uncertain phase. The evidence recovered from Lake's property, his personal writings, and the items connected to missing victims had created a disturbing picture of what investigators believed had happened. But one major question remained. What was the role of Charles Ng? Unlike Lake, who was no longer alive, Ng was still capable of facing the justice system. However, before that could happen, authorities first had to locate him and bring him back to California. The search for Ng would become a long legal and international process, delaying the moment when the evidence collected by investigators could finally be presented in court. When Leonard Lake died in June 1985, Charles Ng was no longer in California. After the investigation began to focus on the crimes connected to the Wilseyville property, Ng left the United States and traveled to Canada. His departure created another obstacle for investigators. The person they believed had participated directly in the crimes was now outside American legal jurisdiction, and authorities had to rely on international cooperation and legal procedures to return him to face charges. The investigation continued despite his absence. Detectives continued examining the evidence left behind by Lake and worked to understand the connection between the two men. But without Ng in custody, the case could not move forward toward trial. In July 1985, only weeks after the discovery of the evidence connected to Lake, Charles Ng was arrested in Calgary, Canada. His arrest occurred after another theft incident. During an attempt to escape, Ng shot a security guard before he was captured by authorities. This new criminal incident resulted in his detention in Canada and began the legal process that would eventually determine whether he would be returned to California. However, bringing Ng back to the United States would not happen quickly. The extradition process became a lengthy legal battle. Ng fought against being returned to California, raising concerns about the possibility of receiving the death penalty if convicted. His legal challenges continued for years, delaying the trial and keeping the case unresolved. For investigators and the families of victims, the delay meant waiting longer for accountability. The evidence had already been collected, but the legal system still had to determine how and when Ng would face prosecution. The extradition process became a significant part of the case because it demonstrated the complexity of handling a serious criminal investigation involving multiple jurisdictions. The crimes under investigation had occurred in California, but the accused individual was in another country. Before the court could decide guilt or innocence, there first had to be a legal decision about whether Ng would be returned to face trial. During this period, prosecutors continued preparing their case. Their challenge was unusual and complex. The person believed to have created the plan, Leonard Lake, was dead. This meant prosecutors could not rely on his testimony or question him about his relationship with Ng. Instead, they had to build their argument through the evidence Lake left behind and through the connections between Ng, the victims, and the Wilseyville property. The evidence collected during the investigation became the foundation of the future prosecution. The journals, videos, personal belongings, and other materials discovered by investigators would become central to explaining what happened. Prosecutors would later argue that these items demonstrated that Lake and Ng were not simply two people who happened to be connected, but that they worked together as partners. The question of Ng's involvement became one of the most important issues in the entire case. Investigators believe that Lake was the person who developed the ideas behind Operation Miranda and created the system connected to the Wilseyville property. However, prosecutors argued that Ng was not merely a follower or an observer. They believed he actively participated in the crimes and shared responsibility for what happened. This argument would eventually become the foundation of the prosecution's case. At the same time, the defense strategy that would later emerge focused on separating Ng from Lake's actions. Ng's position was that Lake was the person responsible for planning and controlling the crimes. The defense would argue that Lake was the dominant figure and that Ng's role had been exaggerated by prosecutors. This conflict over responsibility would become the central question presented to the jury years later. In 1991, after years of legal challenges, Charles Ng was finally returned to California to face charges. His arrival marked the beginning of the final stage of the case. The investigation that had started with missing persons reports, a stolen vehicle, and evidence discovered at a remote property was now moving toward a courtroom where prosecutors would attempt to prove their accusations. The time between the discovery of the crimes and Ng's return had been long, but it allowed authorities to continue organizing the evidence and preparing the case. By the time Ng returned, investigators had spent years examining the materials connected to Lake and the Wilseyville property. They had worked to establish links between missing victims and the evidence recovered during the investigation. The challenge was not simply proving that crimes had occurred. The challenge was proving the specific role of Charles Ng. The absence of Lake created a situation where the prosecution had to rely heavily on physical evidence and careful reconstruction. There was no single statement that explained everything. Instead, the case would be built from many individual pieces. The prosecution would need to show how those pieces connected and why they demonstrated Ng's involvement. The victims' disappearances, the evidence found at the property, the materials created by Lake, and the connection between the two men would all become part of that argument. The legal process also reflected the emotional weight of the case. For families who had waited years for answers, Ng's return to California represented progress toward accountability. But it also meant revisiting painful memories and confronting the possibility that the trial would reveal disturbing details about what happened to their loved ones. Justice in cases like this is not only about punishment. It is also about recognition, recognizing the victims, acknowledging what happened, and creating an official record of events. As preparations continued, the case moved closer to one of the most closely watched trials in California. The evidence collected from Wilseyville would finally be presented publicly. The questions surrounding Leonard Lake and Charles Ng would be examined in court. Prosecutors would argue that Ng was an active participant, while the defense would attempt to portray him as someone controlled by Lake. After years of investigation, legal battles, and uncertainty, the final stage of the case was about to begin. The courtroom would become the place where evidence, arguments, and testimony would determine whether Charles Ng would be held responsible for the crimes connected to one of California's most haunting investigations. After years of investigation, international legal battles, and uncertainty surrounding the events at the Wilseyville property, Charles Cheetah Ng finally faced the justice system in California. The trial that began in 1998 represented the final stage of a case that had started more than a decade earlier with a series of disappearances and the discovery of evidence connected to Leonard Lake. By the time the trial began, investigators had spent years examining the materials recovered from Lake's property, studying the connections between victims and suspects, and preparing a case against the only remaining defendant. The central question before the court was not whether Leonard Lake had been connected to the crimes. The focus was Charles Ng and whether prosecutors could prove that he had actively participated in the kidnappings and murders associated with the Wilseyville property. The trial became one of the most complex criminal proceedings in California because of the amount of evidence involved and the difficulty of reconstructing events that had taken place years earlier. Many of the people who could have provided direct accounts of what happened were no longer alive. The victims could not speak for themselves, and Leonard Lake, the person prosecutors believe had designed the operation, had died shortly after his arrest. As a result, the case depended heavily on physical evidence, written materials, and the connections investigators had established over years of work. The prosecution's arguments centered on the relationship between Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Prosecutors described Lake as the person who created the ideas behind Operation Miranda and developed the plans connected to the remote property near Wilseyville. However, they argued that Ng was not simply someone who happened to be present. According to prosecutors, Ng was an active participant who assisted Lake in carrying out the crimes. Their goal was to demonstrate that the evidence showed cooperation between the two men rather than one person controlling another. A major part of the prosecution's case involved the evidence collected during the investigation. Leonard Lake's personal writings became an important piece of evidence because they provided insight into his thoughts and plans. Prosecutors argued that the writings demonstrated preparation and a desire for control. The documents helped establish the background of the crimes and showed how Lake's ideas developed. Over time, the prosecution also presented videos connected to the investigation. These materials were among the most significant evidence because they provided investigators with information that could not be obtained through traditional testimony. The videos, along with physical evidence from the property, helped prosecutors explain their version of events to the jury. Other evidence included personal belongings connected to victims, items found during the investigation, and information linking missing people to Lake and Ng. Each piece of evidence represented part of the larger investigation. The prosecution's challenge was to show the jury how these separate pieces connected together. They needed to demonstrate not only that crimes had occurred, but that Charles Ng was responsible for participating in them. The defense presented a different interpretation of the events. Charles Ng's legal team argued that Leonard Lake was the person responsible for planning and controlling the crimes. They attempted to separate Ng from the actions attributed to Lake, portraying him as someone whose role had been overstated by prosecutors. The defense focused on the idea that Lake was the dominant figure in the relationship, and that the evidence did not prove that Ng had the level of involvement claimed by the prosecution. The question of influence became one of the key issues during the trial. Prosecutors argued that Ng made choices and participated willingly. The defense argued that Lake had greater control and responsibility. The jury had to consider these competing explanations while examining years of evidence collected by investigators. One of the difficulties facing both sides was the passage of time. The crimes had occurred many years before the trial. Memories had faded, evidence had to be carefully preserved, and investigators had to reconstruct events without the direct testimony of many individuals involved. The trial therefore became an examination not only of what happened, but also of how reliably the available evidence could establish responsibility. The prosecution relied on the consistency of the evidence collected over years of investigation. They argued that the combination of documents, physical evidence, and connections between the suspects and victims created a clear picture of Ng's involvement. The defense, however, challenged whether the evidence could prove every accusation beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial lasted for months and became a major legal proceeding. Throughout the process, the court examined the evidence connected to the Wilseyville property and the disappearances linked to Lake and Ng. The proceedings reflected the difficulty of prosecuting a case where one alleged participant was dead and where many victims could not provide their own testimony. The legal system had to rely on the evidence that remained and determine whether it was enough to establish guilt. For the families of victims, the trial represented a long-awaited moment. Years had passed since their loved ones disappeared. The court proceedings could not undo the losses they had experienced, but they provided an opportunity for the facts of the case to be examined publicly. The trial also ensured that the victims' names remained part of the official record. They were not forgotten among the details of the investigation. They were people whose lives had meaning and whose disappearances had brought years of pain to those who cared about them. In February 1999, after considering the evidence and arguments presented during the trial, the jury reached its decision. Charles Ng was convicted of 11 counts of first-degree murder, along with charges related to kidnapping. The verdict established that Ng was legally responsible for his role in the crimes connected to the Wilseyville property. The court sentenced him to death. The conviction brought a legal conclusion to one part of the investigation, but it did not answer every question surrounding the case. The verdict confirmed Ng's responsibility according to the evidence presented in court, but many mysteries remained. The exact number of victims continued to be uncertain. Some disappearances could not be fully connected to the case, and some victims may never have been identified. The conviction of Charles Ng also represented the end of a legal journey that had lasted many years. From the first discovery of evidence in 1985 to the final verdict in 1999, the case had passed through multiple stages: investigation, evidence collection, international legal proceedings, and trial. Each stage revealed more information about what investigators believed had happened. But each stage also showed the challenges involved in seeking justice after crimes have remained hidden for years. The trial of Charles Ng did not erase the tragedy of the victims or provide answers to every unanswered question. However, it created an official judgment about his role in the crimes and established accountability within the legal system. The evidence presented in court transformed a collection of disappearances and unanswered questions into a documented criminal case. Yet beyond the courtroom, the impact of the case continued. Families still carried the loss of loved ones. Investigators continued to consider unanswered questions, and the names of the victims remained at the center of a case that was ultimately about more than two offenders. It was about the people whose lives were taken, the families who searched for answers, and the continuing effort to understand the full truth behind what happened at Wilseyville. The conviction of Charles Ng in 1999 brought a legal conclusion to one of California's most disturbing criminal investigations, but it did not bring complete closure to every question surrounding the case. The court had reached a verdict, and the evidence had established Ng's responsibility for the crimes presented during the trial. However, the story connected to Leonard Lake and Charles Ng remained unfinished in many ways. The investigation had revealed a pattern of violence, a hidden location, and a number of victims, but it also left behind uncertainty. The most important unanswered question was one that had existed since investigators first discovered the evidence at the Wilseyville property. How many people had actually been victims? Authorities confirmed at least 11 victims connected to the case, but investigators believed the true number could have been higher. Evidence discovered at the property suggested that additional people may have been involved, but identifying every victim proved extremely difficult. Without complete records, identifiable remains, or enough evidence to connect specific missing individuals to the crimes, some cases could not be officially confirmed. For the families of missing people, this uncertainty created a painful reality. A conviction could provide a legal answer, but it could not answer every personal question. Families wanted to know what happened to their loved ones, where they had gone, and whether they were among those connected to the investigation. The possibility that additional victims existed meant that the search for answers did not completely end with the trial. The case continued to represent the challenges investigators face when crimes are hidden for years, and when evidence is incomplete. One of the reasons the Wilseyville case remained so difficult was the nature of the crimes themselves. Investigators believed that Lake and Ng had created an environment designed to prevent discovery. The remote location of the property, the absence of witnesses, and the use of stolen identities and personal belongings created obstacles that delayed the discovery of the truth. Many victims were people who could disappear without immediately creating connections between cases. This made the investigation more complicated because there was no single event that revealed everything. Instead, investigators had to assemble the truth from separate pieces of evidence. The discovery of Lake's vehicle after the theft incident involving Ng became the turning point that allowed investigators to connect those pieces. Without that discovery, many of the disappearances might have remained unexplained for much longer. The case demonstrated how important even small pieces of evidence can become in a complex investigation. A stolen item, a vehicle, or a personal belonging can create a connection that changes the entire direction of a case. The investigation also raised continuing questions about the relationship between Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Prosecutors argued that Lake was the person who developed the ideas behind Operation Miranda, while Ng was an active participant who helped carry out the crimes. The court ultimately accepted the prosecution's argument and convicted Ng. However, the exact nature of their partnership remains one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Lake's death meant that many questions about their relationship could never be answered directly. There would never be a full explanation from Lake about his intentions, his plans, or the extent of his actions. Instead, investigators and prosecutors had to rely on the evidence he left behind. His writings, the materials found during the investigation, and the connection between the suspects and victims became the basis for understanding what happened. Another lasting issue connected to the case was the role of technology in identifying victims. Over time, advances in forensic methods, particularly DNA technology, created new opportunities to revisit unresolved questions. The case demonstrated that even decades after crimes occur, new scientific methods can provide information that was impossible to obtain at the time of the original investigation. The identification of additional victims became an ongoing effort, reflecting the continuing importance of returning names and identities to people who had been missing for years. The search for answers was not only about solving crimes. It was also about recognizing the humanity of those who were lost. Each unidentified victim represented a person whose life had existed before becoming part of a criminal investigation. They had families, relationships, and experiences that existed beyond the circumstances of their disappearance. Identifying victims allowed investigators and families to restore those individuals to the story in a way that went beyond evidence and court records. The legacy of the Leonard Lake and Charles Ng case also influenced public understanding of serial crimes and missing persons investigations. The case showed the difficulties involved when offenders operate secretly and when victims disappear, without immediate connections between incidents. It highlighted the importance of communication between investigations and the need to carefully examine patterns that may not be obvious at first. It also showed how difficult it can be to uncover crimes that are deliberately hidden. Unlike cases where there is a clear crime scene or immediate evidence, investigations involving missing persons often require patience, persistence, and the ability to connect information over time. For investigators, the case became an example of how determination and careful evidence analysis can eventually reveal the truth. For the public, it became a reminder that behind every missing person report is a human story. The names connected to the case: Charles Gunner, the Dubs family, Paul Costner, Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor, their son, Robin Stapley, and others, were not simply evidence in a trial. They were people whose lives mattered and whose absence affected those who knew them. The focus on victims is especially important because criminal cases can sometimes become centered around the offenders. The names of suspects often become widely recognized, while victims risk becoming secondary figures in their own stories. However, the true significance of the Wilseyville investigation lies in the lives that were lost and the families who continued searching for answers. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng became known because of the crimes attributed to them, but the lasting importance of the case comes from remembering those who were harmed. The case also demonstrated the limits of justice. The conviction of Charles Ng provided accountability, but it could not restore the victims' lives or completely resolve every unanswered question. Leonard Lake died before facing trial, meaning the full extent of his actions could never be examined in court. Some possible victims remained unidentified, leaving parts of the story incomplete. This reality is common in complex criminal investigations. Justice can establish responsibility, but it cannot always reveal every detail of the past. Decades after the events at Wilseyville, the case continues to receive attention because it represents several difficult themes at once: hidden crimes, missing people, the challenge of investigation, and the search for truth after tragedy. It remains a reminder that criminal cases are not only about offenders and punishment. They are also about the people affected, the families left behind, and the ongoing responsibility to remember those who disappeared. The story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng ended in courtrooms and legal decisions. But the search for complete understanding continues. The evidence uncovered at Wilseyville answered many questions, but not all of them. The identities of all possible victims, the full extent of the crimes, and the complete story of what happened may never be entirely known. Yet the continued effort to investigate, identify, and remember reflects a fundamental principle of justice. Every victim deserves to be recognized, and every lost life deserves to be remembered. The investigation into Leonard Lake and Charles Ng became one of the most disturbing criminal cases in California history because of the nature of the crimes, the evidence discovered, and the unanswered questions that remained afterward. But beyond the suspects, the investigation, and the courtroom proceedings, there was another story that needed to be remembered: the story of the victims. Long before their names appeared in police reports and court documents, they were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They had families, friendships, personal goals, and futures that were interrupted. The true impact of the case cannot be understood only by examining the actions of the two men accused of committing these crimes. It must also be understood through the lives of those who disappeared and the people who continued searching for answers. The investigation identified several victims connected to Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Each person represented a separate life, and each disappearance left behind questions that families and investigators struggled to answer. The discovery of the crimes brought some information, but it also revealed the painful reality that many details might never be fully known. For those who lost loved ones, the investigation was not simply about evidence or legal procedures. It was about understanding what happened and finding a way to acknowledge the lives that had been taken. Charles Chuck Gunner was among the earliest victims connected to Leonard Lake. His case was particularly significant because Gunner was not a stranger to Lake. He was someone who knew him personally and had been part of his life. Gunner had even served as the best man at Lake's wedding. This connection made his disappearance especially troubling because it demonstrated that familiarity. And friendship did not protect someone from becoming a victim. The relationship between Gunner and Lake showed investigators that the crimes connected to the case could involve people from the suspect's own personal circle. Gunner's disappearance became one of the first pieces of a much larger investigation. The Dubbs family represented one of the most tragic aspects of the case. Harvey Dubbs, his wife Deborah, and their one-year-old son Sean disappeared in 1984. The disappearance of an entire family created a different level of concern for investigators. When multiple members of a household vanish, the questions become even more urgent because there are no remaining family members who can provide answers. The loss of a young child made the case particularly painful. Sean Dubbs was only 1 year old, representing a life that had barely begun. The disappearance of the Dubbs family reflected one of the most devastating realities of the investigation. The victims were not statistics. They were individuals whose lives had meaning and whose absence affected others. Paul Costner was another victim whose disappearance became an important part of the investigation. Costner was 39 years old and operated an automobile business. His connection to the case became especially important because his Honda Prelude was later discovered in circumstances connected to Leonard Lake. The vehicle became one of the pieces of evidence that helped investigators understand that separate missing person cases might be connected. For Costner's family and those who knew him, the disappearance represented a sudden and unexplained loss. Like many missing person cases, the early uncertainty created questions that could not immediately be answered. The discovery of the vehicle eventually provided investigators with a path toward understanding what may have happened. In 1985, the investigation became connected to Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor, their young son, and Robin Stapley. Their disappearances occurred during the period when investigators believed Lake and Ng were active. The connection between these individuals and the Wilseyville property became another important part of the case. Lonnie Bond and Brenda O'Connor were not simply names associated with evidence. They were people with relationships and responsibilities. Their child represented another innocent victim whose life was affected by the actions of others. Robin Stapley, who disappeared during the same period, became another person whose disappearance contributed to the growing pattern investigators were trying to understand. The investigation into Lake and Ng revealed how difficult missing person cases can be. Many victims were not immediately connected to one another. Some disappeared in different circumstances, and the connection between them only became visible after investigators discovered evidence linking them to Lake. This delay meant that families spent years without answers. The uncertainty of not knowing what happened to a loved one can be one of the most painful experiences a family can face. Even when investigators eventually uncover the truth, the process can bring both relief and grief. The confirmation of what happened may provide answers, but it also forces families to confront a reality they may have feared. One of the lasting challenges of the case has been the possibility that additional victims remain unidentified. Investigators believe that the number of victims could have been higher than those officially confirmed. Evidence discovered at the property suggested that more people may have been involved, but not every disappearance could be connected with enough certainty. This uncertainty means that some families may still be waiting for answers. The continued use of forensic technology, including DNA analysis, has provided opportunities to identify victims who could not be identified at the time of the original investigation. These advances represent more than scientific progress. They represent the possibility of restoring names and identities to people who have been missing for decades. The process of identifying victims is important because every person deserves recognition. A missing person is not just an entry in a case file. They're someone who lived a complete life before their disappearance. They had memories, relationships, and people who cared about them. Restoring their identity restores part of their story. It also allows families to move forward with knowledge rather than uncertainty. The case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng also serves as a reminder of the importance of focusing on victims rather than allowing offenders to dominate the narrative. Criminal cases often become associated with the names of those accused, especially when the crimes are unusual or disturbing. However, the victim should remain at the center of the story. Their lives existed before the crimes, and their identity should not be defined only by what happened to them. The purpose of examining cases like this is not to create fascination with offenders. It is to understand the human cost of violence and the importance of justice. The legal system eventually determined Charles Ng's responsibility, but a conviction could never fully repair the damage caused by the crimes. Justice could establish accountability, but it could not return the victims to their families. Leonard Lake died before facing trial, leaving many questions unanswered. Some possible victims may never be identified. These realities demonstrate the limitations of even successful investigations. A case can reach a legal conclusion while still leaving personal questions unresolved. More than 4 decades after the events connected to Wilseyville, the victims remain the most important part of the story. The evidence, the trial, and the investigation all exist because people disappeared and because families demanded answers. Their stories remind us that behind every criminal case are real lives. The names connected to the investigation represent individuals who deserved safety, dignity, and the opportunity to continue living their lives. Remembering them is not only a way to honor the past, it is also a reminder of why investigations continue, why evidence matters, and why justice must always begin with recognizing the humanity of those who were lost. The case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng remains one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in California history, not only because of the crimes attributed to the two men, but because of the many unanswered questions that continued long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The investigation revealed a hidden world built around violence, secrecy, and control. It exposed how two individuals could create an environment where crimes remain concealed for years, and how difficult it can be for investigators to uncover the truth when victims disappear without witnesses or immediate connections. But beyond the details of the investigation, the evidence, and the legal battles, the lasting legacy of the Wilseyville case is found in the victims, their families, and the continuing effort to understand what happened. When investigators first connected Leonard Lake and Charles Ng to the missing persons cases, they were faced with a complex challenge. They were not investigating a single event with a clear beginning and end. Instead, they were attempting to reconstruct a series of disappearances that had occurred over time. The evidence pointed toward a pattern, but understanding that pattern required patience and careful analysis. The discovery of Lake's vehicle after the theft involving Ng became the unexpected turning point that allowed investigators to begin connecting separate pieces of information. What appeared to be an ordinary criminal incident revealed evidence connected to missing people and opened the door to a much larger investigation. The Wilseyville property became the center of that investigation. It was there that authorities discovered evidence they believed connected Lake and Ng to the crimes. The materials recovered from the location, including personal belongings, written documents, videos, and other evidence, allowed investigators to begin reconstructing events that had taken place away from public attention. The property represented more than a physical location. It represented the place where investigators believed the offenders attempted to create a private world separated from normal society. The evidence surrounding Operation Miranda provided important insight into Leonard Lake's thinking. His writings demonstrated ideas centered around survival, control, and the belief that he could create his own rules outside the boundaries of society. Investigators believe these writings showed that the crimes were not random acts of violence, but actions connected to a developed plan. The documents became important because they revealed the way Lake viewed his actions and the distorted beliefs that influenced them. However, the case was never only about Leonard Lake. The legal process ultimately focused on Charles Ng because he was the surviving suspect. After Lake's death, prosecutors had to build their case without the testimony of the person they believed was responsible for creating the plan. They relied on the evidence Lake left behind and argued that Ng had participated actively in carrying out the crimes. The trial became a test of whether the evidence could prove Ng's role beyond a reasonable doubt. The conviction of Charles Ng in 1999 provided a legal conclusion. He was found guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder and related charges connected to kidnapping. The sentence represented the judgment of the court and established accountability for his role in the crimes. Yet even after the verdict, the case did not provide complete answers. Some questions remained unresolved, particularly regarding the possibility of additional victims. The uncertainty surrounding the number of victims remains one of the most haunting aspects of the investigation. Authorities confirmed at least 11 victims, but they believed the total number could have been higher. Evidence suggested that other people may have been connected to the crimes, but without enough information to prove specific cases, some disappearances remained unresolved. This uncertainty meant that the investigation continued in another form, the search for identities, answers, and recognition for those who may have been lost. Advances in forensic technology have changed the way investigators approach old cases. DNA analysis and other scientific methods have provided new opportunities to identify victims and revisit unanswered questions. In cases like Wilseyville, where time and missing evidence created significant challenges, modern technology offers the possibility of discovering information that was unavailable decades earlier. Every identification represents more than solving a mystery. It represents the restoration of a person's name and the recognition that their life mattered. The story of the victims remains the most important part of understanding the case. The names connected to the investigation: Charles Gunner, Harvey Dubbs, Deborah Dubbs, Sean Dubbs, Paul Costner, Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor, their child, Robin Stapley, and others were not simply pieces of evidence. They were individuals whose lives existed beyond the circumstances of their disappearance. They had families, relationships, and personal histories. Their stories deserve attention because the impact of violent crime extends far beyond the immediate victims. It affects everyone who loved them and everyone who waited for answers. The case also serves as a reminder of the difficulties involved in investigating missing persons cases. Many victims disappear without immediate evidence of what happened. Their cases may remain separate for years until investigators discover a connection. The Wilseyville investigation demonstrated the importance of persistence, communication, and careful examination of evidence. It showed that even when the truth is hidden, investigators can uncover it by following the details. Another important lesson from the case is the danger of allowing offenders to define the story. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng became widely known because of the crimes associated with them. But focusing only on the perpetrators can overshadow the people who suffered. The purpose of examining this case is not to create fascination with criminals. It is to understand how crimes occur, how investigations develop, and how society responds when innocent people are harmed. The case also illustrates the limits of justice. A courtroom can determine guilt and impose punishment, but it cannot undo the damage caused. It cannot return lost lives or completely remove the pain experienced by families. It can provide accountability, but it cannot provide every answer. This reality is especially clear in cases where some victims remain unidentified and where important information may have disappeared with those who committed the crimes. The legacy of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng is therefore not simply a story about two criminals. It is a story about investigation, evidence, justice, and memory. It is about the determination of law enforcement officers who worked to uncover the truth. It is about families who waited for answers. It is about victims whose lives must be remembered beyond the circumstances of their deaths. More than 4 decades after the events connected to Wilseyville, the case continues to represent one of the most challenging examples of a hidden criminal investigation. It remains a reminder that crimes can remain concealed, but they do not disappear. Evidence can survive, questions can remain, and the search for truth can continue long after the original events have passed. Ultimately, the story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng belongs not to the offenders, but to the people whose lives were changed forever. The investigation, the trial, and the evidence all exist because victims lost their lives and families demanded answers. Remembering those victims ensures that they are not reduced to names in a criminal case file. They remain individuals whose lives had value, whose absence was felt, and whose stories continue to matter. The Wilseyville case ended in a courtroom, but its deeper meaning extends beyond a verdict. It is a reminder that justice is not only about finding those responsible. It is also about recognizing those who were lost, protecting those who remain, and continuing the search for truth even when the answers are incomplete. Decades have passed since investigators first walked onto the isolated property near Wilseyville, California. Yet the case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng continues to occupy a unique place in the history of American criminal investigations. It is remembered not because it produced every answer, but because it demonstrated how difficult it can be to uncover crimes that remain hidden from public view. It also revealed the extraordinary amount of patience required from investigators, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and above all, the families who spent years waiting for information about people they loved. Even after the convictions, the evidence preserved from the case continued to be examined, reminding everyone involved that justice is sometimes an ongoing process rather than a single moment in a courtroom. Looking back, one of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation is how unexpectedly it began. There was no carefully planned operation targeting a suspected serial offender. Instead, the chain of events started with what appeared to be an ordinary theft. That seemingly minor incident led officers to Leonard Lake, to a vehicle connected to a missing person, and ultimately to the remote property that would transform numerous unexplained disappearances into one of California's most significant homicide investigations. It serves as a reminder that criminal investigations often develop in unpredictable ways. Small pieces of evidence that initially appear unrelated may later become the foundation of an entirely different case. The Wilseyville investigation also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. When Leonard Lake died shortly after his arrest, investigators lost the opportunity to question the person they believed had developed the ideas behind the crimes. Ordinarily, the death of a primary suspect might have made prosecution almost impossible. Instead, the evidence itself became the witness. The journals, the written materials, the personal belongings connected to victims, and the physical evidence recovered during the investigation allowed prosecutors to continue building their case. The investigation became an example of why careful documentation and forensic examination are essential, particularly when direct testimony is unavailable. Equally important was the role of cooperation within the justice system. The investigation extended beyond a single police department or county. Evidence had to be collected, analyzed, compared, and presented over many years. After Charles Ng left the United States, the legal process expanded beyond national borders. His arrest in Canada and the lengthy extradition proceedings illustrated another reality of modern criminal justice. Serious investigations often require cooperation between different legal systems. Although the extradition process delayed the trial for years, it also demonstrated the importance of following legal procedures, even in cases involving extremely serious allegations. The integrity of the legal process depends not only on reaching a verdict, but on ensuring that the process itself follows established legal standards. The trial itself reflected another principle of the justice system. The burden of proof remained with the prosecution throughout the proceedings. Despite the disturbing evidence collected during the investigation, prosecutors still had to establish Charles Ng's responsibility through admissible evidence presented before a jury. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of events, arguing that Leonard Lake had been the dominant figure and attempting to separate Ng from the planning and execution of the crimes. The jury ultimately rejected those arguments, convicting Ng of multiple counts of first-degree murder and related offenses. The verdict represented the legal conclusion reached after years of investigation, evidence collection, and courtroom examination. Yet legal conclusions and historical understanding are not always identical. Historians, investigators, and criminologists continue to examine the case because several questions remain unresolved. The exact number of victims has never been established with certainty. Investigators confirmed at least 11 victims, while evidence suggested that additional victims may have existed, without sufficient physical evidence or identifiable remains in every instance. Some disappearances could not be formally connected to the case. This uncertainty illustrates one of the most difficult realities in homicide investigations. Sometimes the available evidence can strongly suggest what happened without allowing every individual case to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Advances in forensic science have provided hope that some unanswered questions may eventually receive partial answers. DNA technology has continued to improve dramatically since the 1980s and 1990s. Investigators have revisited evidence in numerous historical cases using methods that did not exist during the original investigations. In the Leonard Lake and Charles Ng case, These advances have already contributed to identifying victims years after their disappearances. Each identification represents more than a scientific achievement. It restores a person's identity, provides families with information that may have been unavailable for decades, and ensures that individuals are remembered by their names rather than remaining anonymous victims in an investigation. For the families affected by the case, however, time does not erase loss. Court verdicts establish legal responsibility, but they cannot restore the years that were taken away or replace the people who disappeared. Many relatives spent years wondering whether their loved ones had left voluntarily, suffered an accident, or become victims of crime. The eventual discovery of evidence answered some of those questions while creating others. Even today, some families connected to unresolved disappearances may continue hoping that future forensic developments will provide information that has remained hidden for decades. The Wilseyville case also reminds us why responsible discussions of true crime should remain centered on victims rather than offenders. Cases involving serial crimes often receive attention because of the individuals accused of committing them. Their names become widely recognized, while the names of victims risk fading into the background. Yet the lasting significance of this investigation lies not in the notoriety of Leonard Lake or Charles Ng. It lies in remembering Charles Gunner, Harvey Dubbs, Deborah Dubbs, Sean Dubbs, Paul Costner, Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor, Robin Stapley, and the other confirmed and suspected victims whose lives were interrupted. They were family members, friends, parents, children, co-workers, and neighbors before they became names in investigative files. The case also offers broader lessons about missing persons investigations. Many disappearances initially appear unrelated because victims come from different communities, have different backgrounds, or vanish under different circumstances. Connecting those cases requires persistence, careful record-keeping, and the willingness to reconsider earlier assumptions. The investigation into Leonard Lake and Charles Ng demonstrated how seemingly isolated reports can eventually reveal a broader pattern once sufficient evidence is collected. Another lasting lesson concerns the danger of hidden violence. The crimes investigated in this case were alleged to have occurred at a private property removed from public observation. This isolation delayed discovery and complicated the investigation. The case illustrates that geography, secrecy, and stolen identities can make criminal investigations exceptionally difficult. It also underscores why every missing person report deserves careful attention, regardless of how little information may initially be available. Ultimately, the legacy of the Leonard Lake and Charles Ng investigation is not defined solely by convictions or legal records. Its enduring importance comes from the continued commitment to truth. Investigators continued searching for evidence long after the initial arrests. Forensic scientists continued examining remains decades later. Prosecutors assembled evidence despite the death of one suspect. Families continued hoping for answers, even when years had passed without new information. Together, those efforts reflect the principle that every victim deserves recognition and that every unanswered question deserves honest investigation. As this story comes to a close, it is worth remembering that true crime is not simply a collection of shocking events from the past. At its best, it documents the consequences of violence, the importance of evidence, the responsibility of the justice system, and the resilience of those left behind. The Wilseyville investigation remains one of the clearest examples of how determination, careful forensic work, and persistence can reveal truths that once seemed permanently hidden. Even when every answer cannot be found, the pursuit of truth itself carries lasting value. The names associated with this case should therefore be remembered not because they appear in legal documents, but because they represent real people whose lives mattered. Their stories continue to remind us why investigations must be thorough, why evidence must be preserved, why justice requires patience, and why the search for truth should never lose sight of the individuals at its center. That, more than anything else, is the enduring legacy of the crimes connected to Wilseyville. Every major criminal investigation eventually reaches a point where the legal proceedings come to an end. Evidence is presented, verdicts are delivered, and court records are archived. Yet some cases continue to resonate long after the final judgment because their significance extends beyond the courtroom. The case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng is one of those investigations. More than 40 years after authorities first uncovered evidence connected to the Wilseyville property, the story continues to be studied not because of sensational details, but because it raises enduring questions about justice, memory, forensic science, and the responsibility to remember those whose lives were taken. It reminds us that the true measure of a criminal investigation is not simply whether convictions are secured, but whether the truth is pursued with care, whether victims are recognized with dignity, and whether the lessons learned help prevent future tragedies. One of the defining characteristics of this case is the contrast between isolation and discovery. According to investigators, many of the crimes occurred in a remote area where the offenders believed they could remain hidden from public view. Distance, privacy, and the absence of immediate witnesses allowed the alleged crimes to continue undetected for a significant period. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that secrecy rarely lasts forever. In this case, a seemingly unrelated theft investigation began a chain of events that ultimately exposed evidence connected to multiple disappearances. The lesson is not that every investigation unfolds in the same way, but rather that persistence and attention to detail remain essential principles of effective law enforcement. Sometimes the smallest clue becomes the key that unlocks an entire investigation. The Wilseyville case also illustrates the importance of evidence over speculation. Much of what investigators were able to establish came not from confessions, but from physical evidence. Written records, recovered property, and careful forensic examination. Leonard Lake's death shortly after his arrest meant that investigators could never question him fully or present his testimony before a court. As a result, the investigation depended on the materials he left behind and on the evidence connecting both suspects to the victims. This reliance on evidence serves as an important reminder that criminal investigations must be built upon verifiable facts rather than assumptions. Even in highly emotional cases, the justice system requires proof capable of withstanding legal scrutiny. Charles Ng's trial reflected that principle. Prosecutors argued that he had been an active participant in the crimes associated with the Wilseyville property, while the defense attempted to place primary responsibility on Leonard Lake. The jury examined the evidence and ultimately convicted Ng of multiple counts of first-degree murder and related offenses. That verdict represented the legal determination reached after years of investigation and courtroom proceedings. It also demonstrated the importance of due process. The seriousness of the allegations did not eliminate the requirement that every charge be supported by evidence presented in court. This commitment to legal procedure protects not only the integrity of individual cases but also public confidence in the justice system itself. Even with a conviction, however, the case remained incomplete in important ways. Investigators officially confirmed at least 11 victims, but evidence suggested that additional victims may never have been identified. Some disappearances could not be conclusively connected because the available evidence did not meet the legal standard required for prosecution. This uncertainty reminds us that criminal investigations sometimes end with unanswered questions. Justice systems are designed to reach conclusions based on evidence, not certainty beyond all possibility. Consequently, some mysteries remain unresolved despite years of careful investigation. The continuing development of forensic science offers hope in cases like this. Advances in DNA analysis have transformed the investigation of historical crimes, allowing authorities to identify individuals decades after their deaths. In the years following the original investigation, Forensic technology continued to contribute to identifying victims connected to the Wilseyville case. Each identification represents more than scientific progress. It restores a person's identity, provides families with long-awaited answers, and ensures that victims are remembered by name rather than remaining anonymous entries in investigative records. These developments also demonstrate that justice is not always confined to the years immediately following a crime. Scientific advances can continue contributing to the search for truth long after legal proceedings have concluded. For the families affected by these crimes, however, time follows a different measure. Court verdicts and forensic reports cannot replace birthdays missed, conversations never shared, or futures that disappeared without warning. Every confirmed victim left behind people who remembered them as more than names associated with a criminal investigation. They were sons and daughters, spouses and parents, friends and co-workers. Their lives contained ordinary moments, conversations, ambitions, routines, hopes that deserve to be remembered alongside the extraordinary tragedy of their disappearance. Recognizing this humanity is essential because it prevents the victims from being defined solely by the crimes committed against them. This perspective is particularly important in discussions of true crime. Public interest often focuses on offenders, especially in complex investigations involving multiple victims. Yet responsible storytelling requires maintaining the victims at the center of the narrative. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng became widely known because of the allegations against them and the legal proceedings that followed. The victims, however, should remain the lasting focus. Their stories explain why investigators worked for years, why prosecutors assembled extensive evidence, and why families continued seeking answers despite the passage of time. The Wilseyville investigation also serves as a reminder of the value of institutional persistence. Detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and support staff each contributed to different stages of the case. No single discovery solved the investigation. Instead, progress resulted from countless individual efforts, examining evidence, comparing records, identifying property, following legal procedures, and revisiting unanswered questions. This collaborative process reflects the reality of major criminal investigations. They are rarely solved by one dramatic breakthrough. More often, they are resolved through disciplined, methodical work carried out over many years. Another lasting lesson concerns the treatment of missing persons investigations. Many victims connected to this case initially disappeared without an obvious link to one another. Different backgrounds, different circumstances, and different locations made early connections difficult to recognize. The eventual investigation demonstrated why every missing person report deserves careful attention, and why information sharing between investigative agencies can be essential. Even when individual cases appear unrelated, patterns may emerge over time through careful analysis. More broadly, the Leonard Lake and Charles Ng investigation reminds us that justice is a continuing responsibility rather than a single event. Legal proceedings establish accountability, but society's responsibility extends further. It includes preserving historical records, supporting advances in forensic identification, assisting families seeking information, and remembering victims with dignity. These responsibilities continue even after courtrooms empty and headlines fade from public attention. Today, the Wilseyville case remains part of American criminal justice history because it reflects both the strengths and the limitations of investigative work. The investigation successfully uncovered evidence, identified victims, and secured a conviction against the surviving defendant. At the same time, unanswered questions remind us that complete certainty is not always possible. Some victims may never be identified. Some details may remain unknown. Yet the absence of complete certainty does not diminish the value of the work that was accomplished. Every identified victim, every documented fact, and every carefully preserved piece of evidence contributed to a more complete understanding of the truth. In the end, the lasting legacy of this case is neither the isolation of the Wilseyville property nor the notoriety of the individuals accused. Its enduring significance lies in the commitment to uncovering the truth despite extraordinary obstacles. It lies in the determination of investigators who continued searching when answers were incomplete. It lies in the resilience of families who refused to stop hoping for information about those they loved. And above all, it lies in remembering that every victim represented a unique human life deserving of dignity, recognition, and remembrance, long after the legal proceedings have concluded and the evidence has been archived. That commitment to truth and to the humanity of the victims remains the most meaningful conclusion to the story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng.